Good evening to one and all. I welcome you all for the webinar on Site and Specificity in Landscape Architecture by Dr. Julian. As we have seen, contemporary cities, suburbs, landscapes all tend to look alike despite their regional settings. The monotony of contemporary landscape reflects indifference on the part of society to the diversity inherent in ecological systems and in human communities. It is necessary to know how built environments work and what designers can do to maintain the clearly recognizable differences between one place and another, and to examine various forces in contemporary society that conceal the influences that gave uniqueness to place. With these objectives in mind, we started a March in Landscape Architecture program at School of Architecture and Design, Manipal University Jaipur. We are now in second intake of the program. Hence this webinar by Dr. Julian to present his views on site and specificity in landscape architecture. I request Professor Anuradha Chatterjee to introduce Dr. Julian.
Thank you, Dr. Madhura. Hi, as the Dean of the Faculty of Design at Manipal University Jaipur, I welcome you, Dr. Julian Raxworthy. Dr. Julian is a landscape architect. He was a senior lecturer at RMIT and QUT in Australia and the University of Cape Town, where he convened the Master of Landscape Architecture and the Master of Urban Design programs. He has been a visiting professor at the universities in the US and France, and is currently Honorary Associate Professor at the University of Queensland, Australia. His most recent book is called Overgrown: Practices Between Landscape Architecture and Gardening, published in 2018 by the MIT Press, supported by the Graham Foundation for the Advanced Studios in the Fine Arts. The title of the talk today is Site and Specificity in Landscape Architecture. Landscape architecture is a discipline focused on site and working with each site's unique physical and cultural characteristics. In this webinar, Julian Raxworthy will look at a range of projects that engage with specific site qualities in the design and introduce a range of theories of site specificity, whilst also exploring the relationship between specificity and principle. So on to you, Professor Raxworthy.
Thanks very much, doctors, and thank you for this opportunity. I'm very excited to be able to speak today. I'm really, I suppose, very invested in this topic of site because it's obviously a fundamental aspect of landscape architecture. You could say it's the entire, reason for existence of landscape architecture. And so what I'm going to do today is I'm going to walk through a range of theories, and all of those, well, not range of theories, I suppose actually a range of projects. And all of those projects will really be focused on looking at the way that designers seem to engage with site. And the reason I focus on that engagement, I think, is because of the fact that I come from, I'm a child of the 80s. But let's not get ahead of myself. I'll now move across to get my presentation going. Let me just get this. So what I'm going to do today in my lecture is I'm going to walk through a range of, as I say, a range of theories. But I want to start first in the 90s, and part of that is to say that when I first studied and first started working with landscape architecture, we were in a very interesting period. A friend, my colleague and friend Lisa Dietrich, has said that really we were in this period where design was beginning to be sort of discovered in landscape architecture. I don't say that I was leading it or in any way apart from a participant, but in a way before the internet came, when you wanted to find design, you had to thumb through magazines, you had to find friends from overseas, you had to get slides, and it was in a way like a weird trade to find good design. And the main prevailing design at the time was basically a variation of design coming from a school of, and this is again, I'm talking about a landscape architecture context of Australia as a kind of a offshoot of American landscape architecture, because Australian landscape architecture at that time was was dominated by practices that, or practitioners that had come from a landscape architecture background from the US, from Harvard or University of Pennsylvania, or through the offices of Sasaki, Walker and Associates. And they utilized a method that was really summarized by this method from Kevin Lynch and Gary Hack. And that method is sort of summarized in site planning. And one of my earliest pieces of writing, in fact, was about site specificity. And what I was really interested in was this question about how we engage with site and how we think we're engaging with site. In site planning, Lynch sets up a kind of an overlay technique, and it's an overlay technique we also know from people like Ian McHarg. And in a way, we now assume overlay techniques because Photoshop has got layers, AutoCAD has got layers. And in actual fact, we're really driven by that idea in a fundamental way. But back then, getting a couple of pieces of tracing paper on top of each other and a pen and tracing things over things and aerial photos, which were very rare, was a really dominant method. And the main method that was utilized was one where one identifies a feature, one puts a node on it, like a big asterisk, and then another asterisk, and then one develops a circulation system by linking asterisks. One considers the boundary, one puts the uses down, and bang, one has a site design, and the whole design comes from amplifying that diagram. And that was really the dominant method at the time, and probably is to some degree still the dominant method. And I thought to myself at the time, how do we understand what site is in that context? And the thing I came across was something that was happening at RMIT at the time. There was a conference. And again, this is sort of the period of postmodernism, right? There's a conference called the Culture of Landscape Architecture, EDGE 2 it was called. And this idea that landscape architecture had a culture was a really interesting idea to me, that there was a culture of practice and a way of working. And in actual fact, that way of working was really about this kind of method to some degree. And that the sort of provocation of that conference was to say, let's treat the focus itself as the discipline. Let's look at what the discipline does and how the discipline operates, because the discipline creates everything that comes from it. And so in a way, the product of the culture of landscape architecture is certain sort of design. If we don't look critically, self-consciously at the discipline itself and how it does what it does, we're just going to keep producing exactly the same thing. And that was in a way my main argument of my early writing on this topic. And so that method, as I said, I described it to you. But instead, what I was really, I suppose, I became really interested in is that we project, and this is something I wrote in this essay back then, we project onto sites what we want, how we want to read them. It's actually, we bring this culture, we bring our own biographies, we bring our own politics, we bring our own, for me, as we can't ignore at this time, our own privileged ways of seeing, we bring those to bear, and out of that, we think that we see, but in actually we project. And so this next image here is from, Caspar David Friedrichs, the sort of the Wanderer in the Fog. And the reason I show it is that in a way, once we start to ask this question about specificity, we can't help but sort of try to draw attention in some sense to the observer. And so inevitably we are the observer, but we have to consider that role. And in architecture, the kind of idea about phenomenology has been a key driving factor in that idea about finding specificity is about experience. And I am a strong believer in that. And I think that for landscape experience is and should be the fundamental driver for what the discipline is about. And on the one hand, I mean it romantically, and on the other hand, I mean it completely practically, because in a way, I think that the one thing that I was taught by my teacher, Peter Conley, maybe there's some, I think it's a bit too late for any Australians to be on this, but in actual fact, my teacher, Peter Conley, was very interested in the idea that what we need to learn is already in the landscape. And in my teaching of landscape, I really focus on that, which is to say that the landscape itself has so much to teach us. And whenever we're in a problematic situation about a design or about how to go or how to build, I think this aspect of observation is our first go-to and must be our first go-to. And so when I was teaching at the University of Virginia, I was teaching a group of students and I said, today we're going on a field trip. And they said, what should we bring? And I said, bring all of the usual stuff you take on a field trip, your sketchbook, maybe something to measure with, camera. Back then it was before you really needed a camera, had a camera and a phone, but bring all that stuff, get ready. Okay, we meet in studio at this time. And so then we walked out the door and we walked onto the street, and I said, you've arrived at your field trip site. And what I was trying to get to was, now your job is to look at the everyday things around you and see them in a different way than you've seen them previously. And that's why this figure in this picture, when we look at him, we're trying to wonder what he sees in that landscape, what his imagination is of that landscape, what his reading is, how perhaps he's projecting some sense onto that landscape. And with that in mind, I think it's also worth sort of stepping for a second into art history and to acknowledge that in the sort of period that became known as the picturesque, and also this is a late 19th century piece, but in art from probably the 17th century until the later part of the 19th century, the focus of art was actually on landscape qualities. And in really a lot of the landscape was, a lot of art was about trying to either read at the same time as trying to project. If we look at the art of the French picturesque artists, Poussin, Lorraine, they were just drawing idealized landscapes. And so always within this is a recognition of the relationship between landscape as it is, landscape as seen, versus landscape as projected or read. This takes me on to a kind of a really interesting artist who I'm a really big fan of, called Ian Byrne. Now, Ian Byrne passed away, but Ian Byrne had an amazing project, a kind of art project that he was undertaking. And that art project was really a project that was, I mean, he was a political guy. So a lot of the time he was involved in the union movement. He was involved in a movement called Art and Language. And what that movement really was focused on was a kind of the idea that art is something that the everyday person has an engagement with and should have an engagement with, and that it's a political tool. And so in this series, what he did was, over a series of years, he would drive to his holiday house and he would stop off at second-hand stores, and he'd find these landscapes that were done by amateurs, and they weren't beautiful. And so his only criteria was that if he saw one, he bought it. And so what this picture is, he would then transpose text on top of that, and he would try to find a way of understanding what the person who painted that landscape was trying to see and was trying to say. And so when he talks in here, on the one hand, he's trying to recognize that the sort of reading of sight is a kind of a language. He talks about deserted language. So this idea of language being empty, but also the desert as the site of language. And in a way, he then talks about it itself. And this sort of relationship between the characteristics of something and the way we read it is really important and is really the basis of what this lecture is kind of going to be about. So I'm going to start in a way from the least site-specific thing. Right? I have a term, the term I use is interpretation machines. And interpretation machines is a term that really refers to the idea that sometimes when you a teaching observation, from the students I was working with particularly in the early 2000s and the late 90s, it seems like the main thing that they were doing was interpreting sight. And so you could say, like, were you designing a school? What program you were having? And I mean, for the new landscape architecture people and for the other landscape architects in the audience, program is a very sort of problematic space for landscape architecture. It's a problematic space because, architecture has program. It has, in functional briefs, it tells you how many square meters it wants for this and that. When we start to talk about recreation, whatever recreation is, what is that as a program? If it's a lovely program, it's a place where we recreate ourselves. How much are we willing to spend for that on a square meter? And so this aspect of program becomes a really problematic thing in landscape. And I think there's been a kind of monetization of program as a way of being able to allow landscapes to have financial value. So what's the interpretation as a program is to say that sight reading in itself is a kind of program. It's a kind of job. And so in a way, to some degree, one of the types of jobs that landscape architects do is to interpret sight. And so we have to be aware what we bring, what we project, how we read, etc. So what I'm going to talk about is a few of these projects that I would call the sort of these interpretation machines. And I call them machines because in a way they're devices to help us interpret. Now this is a scheme that a lot of people will know. I don't think there's probably many people who don't, but if they don't, let's just talk about it for a second and say, the Vietnam Veterans Memorial is essentially a sort of demonstrates a key aspect about contemporary landscape architecture and where it's sort of developed from, which is since particularly in the 80s, the relationship of landscape architecture and art has been very fundamental. And a lot of that, if we think about sort of landscape architects like Martha Schwartz, if we look at the influence of land art, it's been a fundamental aspect of landscape architecture and its languages. And this project, which we may or may not be familiar with, is quite interesting. You know, it's in the mall, so it's in the biggest ceremonial space of the US. It's right, you know, running right through. It's sort of calibrated into that landscape, and up until that point, landscape architecture had really, or not landscape architecture, pardon me, public sculpture had been, you know, representational. It had been figurative, and so this was a really major change insofar as it moved away from the object being the kind of figuration, you know, Abraham Lincoln, whatever it might be, that there is a figure that is figured, to an idea that Beth Meyer talks about, who's a really amazing landscape architecture theorist, Elizabeth K. Meyer. She's written about, and she calls figured ground, which is in a way about how we shape topography. And so what this is in a way that one of the first pieces of datascape, essentially, because what it is it's a representation of the war on two axes, where the Vietnam War has a pivot around the center, which is the high point of the war, where the war was the largest amount of casualties, and then it pivots towards the other direction as the amount of deaths taper off. So it's actually a topographic representation of a graph, is what it is. And so it's an interpretation machine insofar as it's providing a whole different interpretation of this event, the war, but it's also very related to the space of the site in which it's in. So it's both a critique of the rest of Washington, D.C.'s monuments in that ceremonial space. It gets to some of the subversiveness of the fact that the Vietnam veterans were feeling excluded because of the political climate from the memorialization that had gone from the kind of soldiers in the past. And so it's a very subversive act. And it's interesting also because it's been so widely appreciated. And I mean, if we look at sort of a key thing here, you'll see that here is a veteran or a veteran's family often turning up to that site, taking an impression from that piece of a person that obviously means something to them. And so, you know, it's also provided, and you can see how there's a piece of paper, Vietnam Veterans Memorial. So it's part of the interpretive act of it to provide people this opportunity to engage with it. This interpretation machine here is to say, on the one hand, it seems like it's got nothing to do with site, but on the other hand, it's highly engaged with site, even though it's incredibly abstract. Now, you know, this is where I think if we're talking about this period of the 1990s into the 2000s, or I suppose the 80s into the 90s, to some degree, there was an interest in that time with meaning generally. And the next project I'm going to talk about is this project called the Garden of Remembrance, and it's in Duisburg, and people might be familiar with Duisburg Nord. And so this project really, Duisburg Nord Industrial Park, a very important park, but there's quite a lot of sites around Duisburg that were part of what's known as the Eber Emscher Park. Could give a whole other lecture about that, but ultimately there was a competition as part of the International Baustellung of Architecture competitions, where the valley of, or the area of the Ruhrgebiet, which is the Ruhr River, basically a competition was undertaken. And that competition, the kind of main principle of it was around, or it was an exhibition, it was around this idea of the kind of the overall landscape of the entire river valley as being a sort of city or a park with cities inside it. And there were sort of ruined industrial sites. Park Duisburg Nord was another one. I could have talked about that in this situation as well. There was a range of them, and each of them had a really interesting way of working with what was existing. And in this project, this Israeli landscape architect was working with another Israeli architect, and this is a kind of community centre here, and the rest of the site is in a way made up of a series of traces, and I'll talk about traces more as we go along. But essentially a whole range of relics and marks and geometries from the previous uses, so from the period prior to the demolition of this site during the war, were actually embedded and etched into that landscape. And so this comes in this sort of interpretation machine aspect. The geometry, essentially the kind of design act, is find a geometry that's related to the mark of the previous site use, that invisible geometry. And from this invisible geometry, you know, transpose into that invisible geometry the dumb conventionalities of landscape, paths, trees, surfaces, and then use that geometry and elements like found objects in that landscape, whether it be sort of frames of derelict buildings, or, you know, pieces of ruined bunker and stuff, or archaeology in the site, or whether it be traces of geometries underneath the ground, to be able to tell that history. And a key part of that, I think, is around this idea of meaning being elusive. And so sort of one version of that in that period, the sort of didactic aspect of telling the story of place was, it was seen as being was like a faux pas if something was direct. If you could get it straight up, then it was a sort of a poor design. And so instead there was this interest in invisible geometries being brought to the surface. Now, if we see the way that these geometries work here, we're reminded of Daniel Liebeskin's design for the Jewish Museum, and the way that Libeskind brought in pieces of script. He brought in geometries from linking sites in Berlin to create a kind of a key word at the time, palimpsest, to be able to read this, to read these sites. And so yes, meaning it was at that time something that was highly abstract. In a way, a kind of political critique you could make about that was, and it's still something which we find now, is that in a way, by making it ambiguous like this, it becomes something that has a history in landscape which is around taste. And so if we look at the history of landscape going back to Versailles, if we look at it going back to the English landscape garden, the landscape was not actually, up until Olmsted potentially, was not really about common people at all. The landscape was about amateur experts with good taste. And so in a way, an argument could be made that by embedding these meanings that you don't immediately understand, you're actually required to, only certain people in the know will get those meanings. And I mean, one of the classic projects that would be like that is this one. Now, again, I put these ones together because they're a part of a period which was really about this idea of site as interpretation, site as a place where abstract readings are imposed onto the site. And so this is the Garden of Australian Dreams at the National Museum of Australia. It's designed by Room 413, which was a collaboration between Vladimir Sitar, the amazing Australian Czech landscape architect, and Richard Weller, who's now the head of the landscape architecture program at the University of Pennsylvania. And this is a highly contentious project in Australia, in Canberra, the national capital. And you know, this is done by a practice called Ashton Raggett McDougall. The architecture was by them. And what we can see in this is straight away is that it's a kind of assemblage of things. It's an assemblage of meanings. And it's this idea of meaning being contested, multiple interpretations. And so if we look at it, for example, and we bring the interpretations I only know because I've actually written about and talked to various people involved in the project, you know, we have things in the landscape like there's these, here we have these blue poles. And for example, this is a reference to the fact that in the 1970s, Gough Whitlam, the Prime Minister of Australia, he famously bought Jackson Pollock's blue poles for, I think, $1 million, which was the largest amount of money ever spent on an artwork at the time. And the fact that it was so abstract was kind of offensive to Australians at the time. And so that's actually like a reference to that. Inside here is a camera obscura. Again, this idea that one can see that place differently. You know, in the landscape here, we see a series of these sort of maps, and those maps comprise an overlay of the maps of Aboriginal Australia and the language groups of Australia. And Australia had a huge amount of different Indigenous communities and nations in it, all with different languages. And the map of Australia of those groups is incredibly complex. And in this drawing, the designers overlaid that map with the colonial map and tried to suggest some sort of frisson between them. We have the surveyor's mark, here, which is a sort of indication about the fact that Australia was surveyed by, the act of surveying is one of these projective acts. If we think about designing, we take the survey in a fundamental way, but what you include in the survey will ultimately be what you react to in the design. And so again, this idea that site is about projection. What shall a surveyor map? You have to really tell them to map a tree. When they map the tree, which trees are they going to map, which aren't they going to map? When they map something, they'll map it on the basis of solidity. It's a building, it's a legal boundary, it's map it on the basis of contract. This aspect of projection and reading is super important. In terms of this other landscape I mentioned earlier, the sort of Daniel Libeskind here. Daniel Libeskind took Ashton Raggett McDougall to court. This is a miniature version of the Jewish Museum in Berlin, and it was dedicated to the Institute of Torres Strait Islander and Aboriginal Studies. And so basically that was in a way a reference to say that a kind of genocide happened in Australia against Aboriginal people, and by miniaturizing it, the designers were drawing upon another source to bring it back in. And I think the main thing which was abstract and which infuriated people was that, you can see two kind of axes here. On the one hand, you can see this kind of curl. Now, Canberra was designed by Walter Burley Griffin and Marion Marnie, his wife, who's often not properly recognised for her involvement in their combined works. And that landscape is a sort of a representation of an organisational diagram of the governance of Australia. And so this sort of snapped axis is about the sort of relationship to the geometries of the city and the fact that they might be frayed. And finally, this other axis here in the landscape, sort of, prosaically next to the car park, this is a line that goes all the way to the real centre that the designers were arguing of the country, which is the Central Australia, so far away that that axis is snapped and recoiled backwards. And so on the one hand, as a sort of a site-specific strategy, these things all would seem to be completely abstract. They would seem to have nothing to do with site. But in a way, they're highly contextual in their own ways, and the fact that they take a position to them. Now, I'm not mad about these necessarily, but I think this typology and this idea of interpretation of site is a fundamental thing, and it's important to recognise that on the one hand, this may be a highly literal thing, and on the other hand, it might be quite an abstract thing.2Now, I'm going to move away from Australia here, and I'm going to talk about another thing that I'll call traces. Now, I've actually got a sort of tripartite typology of site reading, one which is traces, another one of which is I'm calling palette, another one of which I'm calling relationship. Now, traces is an interesting sort of typology, and I think that I look here to a fantastic essay by Elizabeth Meyer, another essay, a great essay by Elizabeth Meyer called from the book Site Citations, well, the book is actually called Site Matters, and her essay is called Site Citations: The Grounds of Modern Landscape Architecture. And in that book, what she does is she looks at a range of ways that not pre-modern, but kind of early modern landscape architecture from the period of, I would say, from Frederick Law Olmsted to Jens Jensen. I mean, she's an American, and so that's her focus. And she talks about a series of different sort of approaches. And the first one she talks about is this idea of site as armature. And for her, site as armature really refers to the fact that there is a kind of like a propensity in site for what comes after. Even when we're talking about somewhere like Versailles, which is one of the most highly manipulated landscapes, it still responded to the basic trends of the topography. It's got a rise in the centre. It feeds in and out of existing water courses. I mean, I'm sure the Prof has a take on this, but Thierry Mariage, in his writing about it, also talks about, in terms of the way that Lenotre adjusted, even though they manipulated massively, its basic kind of trends worked with the existing site's topography. Similarly, Central Park, we think of it when we see Central Park, it's got this amazing boundary. Now, obviously, there's a kind of like an amazing moment for Olmsted and Vaux with this idea about the extent of that, and the commissioners about the idea about what the city might be of having that park. But the underlying geography still drove the spaces of that park in a fundamental way. And Elizabeth Meyer talks specifically about Prospect Park, which has a kind of a meadow running through the centre and then a series of kind of smaller topographic spaces. And so this is a kind of, the site as armature is about the kind of a series of initial conditions or trends that one picks up and one begins to work with. And after that, she talks about the aspect of kind of figuring those. And so once we've started to analyse those sites, she then talks about how they often during the kind of proto-picturesque or the picturesque period, they get amplified, exaggerated, and this is the sort of figuration that she talks about. And then the next thing she talks about, and particularly in the work of Jens Jensen in Chicago, is she talks about site fragments. And here she's talking about things that are found on site. So this is a kind of good hook into these projects. Now, as I said, I went to, I was in South Africa for 5 years, and South Africa is a extremely unequal society, and a place of great learning for somebody like me who's, you know, I think in Australia we don't really have a strong appreciation for the colonialism that we're the victors from, and I think that South Africa, you can't help but know that. And I think that was a very useful experience and something that comes back to me in these days with the George Floyd and the Black Lives Matter protests. And so I'm going to talk about two landscapes here that work with traces in different ways, and they're at the totally opposite ends of the spectrum. And so this first one is an amazing and one of the most beautiful projects I've ever seen. And it's a project by architecture practice called Studio Masson by a garden designer called Francesca Watson, and it's in a suburb called Hego Vale, which is at the bottom of of Table Mountain. And so Table Mountain is at the back here. You know, if you're going to be a landscape architect, and I know that there's not that many students of landscape architecture, there's probably a lot more practitioners, but the practitioners will be able to tell you as well that understanding geology is the building block of the entire basis of landscape architecture. And in a way, we have to work from that, because we can think about the idea that between the atmosphere and climate above and the geology below, and the two time intervals they have, the atmosphere's time intervals being incredibly fleeting and the time intervals of geology being incredibly long, there's this membrane in between of the soil and the organisms, which is in the time frame that is partly calibrated between the two of them. And so geology is incredibly important. And often when I go to a place, the first thing I will ask is, what is the geology? Tell me about the geology, because from the geology, we can unpack basically everything else we need to know. And for those of you who are architects, I think this is a super important part, and understanding geomorphological systems, ecological systems, and really getting a sort of fascination with them is the foundation to landscape architecture practice. And so Table Mountain and this Table Mountain group here is, if we look at the geology of it, the actual main body of the mountain is actually sandstone from the Table Mountain group. And then underneath it, there are a series of volcanic intrusions of granite. And so those intrusions come through and pop through the sandstone. And so that's why this is a really interesting spot, because the whole back we're looking at behind here is all sandstone. And in actual fact, here we have a piece of granite. And the nature of granite is that it weathers in a certain sort of way. Granite's a very interesting rock to work with. And I come from a background before I studied landscape I was a landscape contractor, and one of my things I was really into was working with stone. And granite is an interesting material because you can cut it reasonably easily. It's not, it's not super easy, but it's not as hard as other things. And then, you can work with it in a certain sort of way. And so the first thing that they discovered in this garden was that they had these enormous pieces of stone in that landscape. And they actually, once they had them, they didn't actually know their extent. And so when you look at this here, you can see that there is a mark along that stone there. And so that mark there is basically, you know, that sort of greying there. And so really what they did was that they had a hunch about that stone. And so what did they do? They start digging. And so they started digging, and, you know, this was a hillside, and they dug down to create a flat area. And out of that, they then imposed this pool. And so in a way, that kind of thing where, as you know, as Beth Meyer would say, this sort of idea of the armature, the initial conditions, in a way that suggests a way forward was, at the first instance, was to kind of excavate in and cut down and then create a space out of the subterranean, not the subterranean, but the hidden landscape. And from that, they created this amazing pool, and they then move you through that site and cut you through that space. And so then that's the sort of space one moves through. Now, it's a very dense inner city. You're not dense, actually. It's a reasonably wealthy area, very wealthy area. And so they created this sort of brick walls around the outside, and then a sort of a building within those. And so they cut through this bank down here where you move through, and then you enter into another space in the building. And essentially in the building, you're moving to get to the building, you're moving through these sort of between these two walls that curve around. Interestingly, the landscape architect, or the garden designer, I should say, Francesca Watson, who's, you know, not a landscape architect, and it's worth mentioning, you know, Frederick Law Olmsted wasn't a landscape architect. You know, Roberto Burle-Marx wasn't a landscape architect. And most of, you know, many of the greatest landscape architects around were not trained, they were actually enthusiasts. And Francesca's like that. She's actually a ballet dancer who found her way into garden design. And the reason that this is, I would still call this a site-specific strategy, is that if you look at the ground situation here, and we're looking here at the space between these two walls, that's a totally invented space. It's not really about context. The parts that are about context are the fact that you can see that there's all of these, you know, all of these granite stepping stones here. They're from the material that was excavated out of the site. But then you'll see that there's sort of clumps of ferns. There's bits of you know, they're actually called baby's tears growing along between this. And what you're seeing here is an interesting situation where the reason that Francesca was so successful is that she didn't necessarily rely on a drawing. So where we move into a really interesting space of landscape architecture. Architecture is so used to the idea, and landscape as well, that we can actually find our way through by drawing everything. In actual fact, what Watson was doing was responding to the found conditions, putting a plant here, putting another plant there, making their way through that landscape, and then making very site-specific decisions within it. And that's a fascinating approach, and one that you can't necessarily draw, that you have to do on site. So therefore we see that a site-specific response might also change the entire way that we practice. And some of the great landscape architects, for example, I know Craig Burton in Sydney, a fantastic landscape architect, a lot of his work is actually site-driven. And so, you know, another beautiful moment in the project is, you know, that they created this sort of outdoor shower that sort of directs stuff off from the roof level onto that, into that landscape on top of the site, you know, on top of the building. You know, they have these inside the building, they have these beautifully calibrated views from inside towards the mountain. Again, they're faking the foreground. There's buildings behind there, so they're working with the foreground to give you a sense of specificity in the back. So it's a kind of like a faking of that context. And then on the roof of the project, you know, they built this amazing, there's the architect there, Michael, and they built this amazing sort of rooftop garden of grasses back towards the mountain. Now, that's in total contrast to another site which is in a different part of town called Kailicha. Now, this is like 5 k's away, and so I know that you know, I've had a little bit to do with the Indian Institute for Human Settlements, who I came into contact with through the African Centre for Cities, and I know that they work in a lot of contexts like this, and so that contrast is sort of quite extreme. And this project by my colleague at the University of Cape Town, Tana Klitsner, was based around reading traces, because it was really focused on the way that trying to find a route through through an area of desire lines. Now there's a term called desire paths or desire lines, and it really refers to the idea of ultimately, you know, humans are annoying mammals that will just go wherever they want to go, and we can only, as a designer, we have to hope that they're going to want to go where we want them to go, and if they won't, then we have to adjust our desires and our circulation systems to where they do want to go from their common sense. And so this project really was a sort of a way of finding a route from this area up here, which is called Harare Square, down to the Harare station here, and it really takes in a kind of a walk from that square along a bit of a road, through some desire lines, and then makes its way under a freeway and then back to the station. And so it's in a way creating a route where it does exist already because it's where people are going, but it's not the circulation system that was designed. Of course, the circulation system that was designed under apartheid. And so in a way, you know, this is one of the biggest townships in Cape Town. And so the main strategy that they undertook was that as a combined architecture and landscape strategy. And I think that landscape and architecture work very well together. Almost all of the work I do is with architects. And I think that landscape is inherently an interdisciplinary profession. It works best when everybody is curious and everybody is interested and nobody's too invested in their own ideas. And it works best in that sort of interdisciplinary frame. And I think that these days, most of the large projects in the world, or any project, is a multidisciplinary project, as we know. And the project's funded by a group from Germany. That's the German bank, that they fund this thing called VPUU, which is Violence Prevention Through Urban Upgrading. And so it's a range of strategies about trying to utilize urban design as a way of trying to create safe spaces, particularly because there's a whole lot of gender violence through there. And so they're really trying to look at a range of strategies to do that. Some of them are concrete strategies, some of them are programming strategies, etc. And so one of the kind of architectural strategies that they do is that they have a series along this route. They have a series of these buildings that are kind of like they're sort of not police stations. They're almost like passively surveilling sites. And so these buildings are a kind of like, they have a community function. They have people living on them. And the idea is that along a kind of walking route, and you know, we can see the kind of nature of that landscape there, with a kind of a lot of informal trade happening in that landscape, in the front yards and the backyards, and some what's known as backyarders happening. And these buildings, as you can see, there's another one there. I think that's this one. These kind of provide a visual link, and they're well lit, and they provide a series of sort of lanterns along the route. Then there's a kind of a strategy of putting in some sort of streetscape treatment that's simple enough to suggest the route, you know. And then they sort of, part of the main strategies of the project was a sort of central area, which is here, and that area really is a sort of a series of playing fields with a community centre in here, and other playgrounds, etc. And that was kind of an existing place where people were playing football. And so it's picking up and formalising what's already there on site in terms of program. So here we're not talking about any form of formal mimicry. We're talking about picking up traces of site planning, picking up traces of urban design, and then kind of creating them in certain sorts of way. Now, I just arrived in South Africa when I first visited this project, and I remember hanging out with Tana and saying, looking at this landscape, and you know, it's interesting for me in a range of ways, because you know, this is the back of somebody's property here, so this is a kind of informal site. Over here is what's known as a shebeen, a kind of illegal bar, but they kind of created it so that people could enter and exit that bar. And I looked at the language of this and I said, Tana, this is not very, very African. And I was very naive in that sense. And of course she said, well, it's in Africa, and it's generated from the existing site diagram. And the main thing is it's tough enough to withstand what's actually happening on the site. So who cares if it's African enough? So if we think about this interpretation machine aspect, the interpretation machine would say everything needs to speak to the theme. Here, site is a range of programs that have manipulated landscape to set up traces that are then followed in the later design moves. You know, as we move back towards as we move through the site, we can see how that kind of axis makes its way through in various ways. you know, through areas of informal trade, etc. You know, there's a kind of crazy story here. I mean, it's an interesting story. Is in this area, you can only basically grow a few species. There's a woman I know, Claire Burgess, an extremely talented landscape architect, and she was saying that there's only 5 plants you can grow in the Cape Flats. I said, 5? How do you know that? And she said, because I've been planting trees in the Cape Flats for 25 years, and so I tried every single one, and I tell you there's 5. And the interesting thing is basically 4 of them were from Australia. And part of the reason for this is that there's a whole lot of factors that will take a plant tree out. I'm sure that the similar thing happens in informal settlements and areas like this in India. You know, not all of it maybe, but you know, one thing is the goats will get in there, and the first thing, the goats will end up chewing the plant down. The next thing, it might get burnt for firewood is the next thing that might happen. And the third thing is it might get used for muti, and muti is basically medicine or black magic. And so, you know, in the way, she had to find trees that would withstand those factors, and they ended up coming from Australia. And then the landscape architects and the conservationists don't like that because it's not an indigenous plant. Now, it's an interesting thing about this idea of the value system of the indigenous or the non-indigenous. I don't know if that debate is happening in India or not, but it's certainly very big in Australia and the US and in South Africa. And so here we see, you know, when you get to the station, the final one of those things following those traces, that desire line route, is another one of these things with a cafe at the bottom. Now, I wrote an article in about 2000, and I've got it here, the date of it here, 2008, called Sandstone and Rust, Designing the Qualities of Sydney Harbour, where I was looking at Sydney Harbour in terms of this idea about site specificity. And there were 2 main sort of approaches in those projects that I sort of picked up on. And those two approaches were one that I called a palette approach, and the other one which I called a relationship approach. And the palette approach is to say that site is a material. And so if we thought about this one here, these traces, site's a material, but it's also a kind of, as Maya would say, it's also an armature. It's a thing that's projecting and pushing the project in some way. When the site is a palette and the site is a material, in a way, our reference, instead of being a kind of series of meanings that are read, that kind of come from the place, are reinterpreted and projected back onto the place, or these traces, the palette approach tries to use the materiality of site as a way of manifesting those things. Now, most of the time I talk to projects that I visited only, so I apologise that I haven't visited this project, but one of my projects that I've always been a fan of from afar, and I'm sure it's as amazing as I know it to be, is this project by Dimitri Pikionis at the Acropolis. And the Acropolis, this landscape project, is an amazing project because it literally collected the leftover pieces of archaeology of that site. I mean, these days the archaeologists would be horrified of that, but the archaeology of literally as a material. And so although Pikionis did these drawings, a lot of the time the work he was undertaking was actually to get those materials and to literally make decisions on site. And as I've said before, you know, and as my book Overgrown sort of talks about, site-specific strategy is also about working on site in a different way, changing your practice. And so here, Pikionis is working with the material of the site, reconfiguring it. And on the one hand, you could say, well, this is not archaeologically correct. This is not a right vernacular for the site. But at the same time, by being literally the material and providing a kind of like a refiguration of that material, Pikionis is actually both being highly contextual and highly contemporary. Now, as we know from things like the Borough Charter, this is actually the way the Borough Charter wants people to work. It wants people to let the new be new, but let the old be old. And so this is a kind of interesting strategy in those terms. So the materiality, that the palette is drawn from the literal material of the site. Another project like that, which is an incredibly beautiful project, is this project, Prague Castle by Plesnik. And Plesnik is an absolutely extraordinary architect who was a kind of he was a sort of proto-postmodernist in a way. He was unpopular at the time a little bit because of the fact that while he was doing this work, modernism was happening. In the same way that Carlo Scarpa was kind of unpopular at the time of modernism because they were doing work, and you know, you might even be able to say someone like Geoffrey Bawa as well. I mean, people who were essentially still innovating, but in actual fact not of their time necessarily. And you know, what Plesnik was doing was, in a way, what he was doing was regularizing an old castle. And so he was kind of doing a series of material acts on that site to change the way that the existing old space was accessed. So similar to Piccionis's project. Now, you know, some of these were working in beautiful ways with you know, this is you know, for me, a beautiful surface. And one of the things I'm really into is when you see paving that's done in a way that is a kind of transcends pattern and begins to sort of find the gaps in the system. So, you know, this is a modular system. Here we have a kind of it's partly the sort of site diagram that moves along here. It's still at the same modular. So, you know, we have two of these modules, make one of those modules, change the color of that one. And we have actually a number of orientating systems within one completely consistent surface, which I think is very, very beautiful. And then we have a kind of playful exaggeration of these kind of motifs. But each time the answer to this site strategy is found in material treatments. And, you know, to some extent, I think that you know, this approach is highly contemporary still. I'm looking at the time, so I'll keep rolling. Another project from Sydney, which is a kind of, for me, a very important project, was this project, Long Nose Point Park, or Yarralbin Park. And it was designed by Bruce Mackenzie. And when I was a horticulture student in the 80s, Bruce Mackenzie was really was the highly influential landscape architect at the time when we were all very interested in kind of the Australian bush and the Australian Indigenous landscape. And so his approach of working with this site was really to keep traces of old uses. So it's got an old dry dock in the base of it, and that's the old dry dock there. This is after it's been slightly reworked. And then it's got, it's got a series of these sandstone sort of floaters within it. When I say floaters, I mean these sort of sandstone platforms. And when he worked on the kind of circulation into the park, he kind of created a series of ramps that join up with these existing pieces of sandstone that are floating on that site. And so that all the way through this landscape, you find the kind of landscape is made out of those, of the levels of those different pieces that are then linked through the whole landscape. You know, some beautiful moments in this, you know, is probably the most photographed moment, and one of the most beautiful moments is this here, where we sort of see this sort of point of the edge of the dry dock, you know, with the sort of casuarina trees, the gravel underneath, and then the harbour bridge in the background. It's a really classic site, and one of the things that's really interesting about the site, and is kind of when I dig into it, is that, and I've talked to Bruce a lot about this, and we have a lot of argument about this essentially, is that these species and these plants are actually somewhat generic. So yes, they're indigenous, well, they're native plants, but we're starting to get to the point where the species of the Westringia here, or the Lomandra here, or the eucalyptus, we're actually starting to use species that are not necessarily exactly endemic to the site. They're starting to reference, they're actually like a reference to the indigenous rather than being literally indigenous. And so you kind of have that interesting thing where it seems like it's a very site-specific, materially based approach, but the materials are actually also, even though they're kind of appropriate and they feel right, they're actually still a sort of a proxy for what's really would have been happening on the site. So that dynamic in these projects where one tries to use materials to indicate the site, in a way we're always asked, how specific is it going to be, and how tight are we going to be in relationship to what's right and what's not right? I don't actually necessarily think that's a productive thing to talk about, but it's one of the questions that comes up when we start to talk about site specificity. Now, a final series of projects here is that the kind of approach that I'm sort of most interested in is to use a term that one of my old teachers, this Peter Connolly, used to say, which is, you know, the site does something to you. And this idea of the site doing something to you is a really important aspect. And I don't think it does something to you necessarily in the sense that that, you know, it messes with your mind, but it does something you insofar as it orientates you and puts you in certain directionalities. It leads to certain chains of consequence, and I think a lot of the time design can be about that. Now, a reading that I refer to a lot, and that is a basic reading, but I still keep going back to it because it's perhaps because it's simple, but perhaps because it really works for me, is by Christophe Giraud, called Four Trace Concepts of Landscape Architecture, from Recovering Landscape, edited by James Corner from '99. Now, it was a precursor before Landscape Urbanism, but it was that book. I keep going back to that book. You know, Anu Matua has an amazing essay in there about the Maidan in that book as well, and it's a fantastic book. But this essay, Giraud talks about 4 trace concepts, and I keep going back to them because I think they're kind of useful, and I'll explain them to you. And the first one is called landing, and landing is basically about the fact that you only get to visit the site for the first time once, which is to say that when you visit a site, you only get to have that experience once, and after that you're in it. And so one has to always be super sensitive to that moment and those initial hunches. And that in a way, it doesn't mean that one has to kind of walk around in this sort of phenomenological fury, but it just means that when you arrive, you need to trust your initial intuition of the site at that moment. And so that sort of idea of landing, I think, is a really useful one, and I've come back to it over and over again, also in how I visit sites as a critic. The next one he calls grounding, and this is different to landing insofar as it's then about successive visits back to the site over and over and over and over and over again as you discover more and more and more and more about it. It's called grounding because, in a way, it's about grounding that first impression. It's also about research. It's where that first hunch is perhaps developed or contested on the basis of what you've discovered. The next one feeds on from that, and he calls it finding, which is in a way similar to what Maya was talking about in terms of this idea of figuring the site, which is to say that how that first hunch makes its way through the research and begins to push forwards into the proposition. And I think part of that, finding is useful because it's a recognition that I'm now finding my way to work with something. I'm now, I'm going to find evidence to support my initial hunch, and finally to end up with founding, which, like foundation, means and the way that you set up the site for the future on the basis of those 3 other things. So it's quite a nice sort of system, and a beautiful project by an amazing landscape architect, Michael van Gessel from the Netherlands. Michael did this incredibly beautiful project, which is in Grebbeberg, and it's actually an old Merovingian ring fort. And for sci-fi nuts like me, the Merovingians were in the Matrix movie. There's a character called the Merovingian, but so I recognise this term. But the Netherlands is an interesting place insofar as it's a kind of liminal territory, and so people were essentially settling in the floodplain. Now here, this is actually on the edge of the Rhine floodplain, and so it's really as it tops off. So it's one of the few places with topography in the Netherlands, and so this is the ring fort diagram we can see. And what's nice about it is it puts you in a place where you can really experience this geometry. And so the kind of one of the first moves that you go to when you get to the site is that you come to this cut, this Corten cut. And what's interesting there is if you think about how you read topography, how you read artificiality, how would you read artificiality in a landscape covered in vegetation? And so what's nice about this is by cutting through that slope, the actual artificiality of that topography is revealed. So if you didn't cut through it, you wouldn't know that it was actually shaped as a mound. You wouldn't know that it was artificial. So that cut shows the geometry by showing a section, which then shows I'm in something that's made, even though the landscape is not really manipulated very much. As you move next into that landscape, you then reach the center, and then what happens is that there's a series of steps where you can then move on top of the mound. And so then the mound, your relationship with the mound changes, and you then move around the mound. And so that's then to experience the mound as the geometry it might have had when the Merovingians were using it to defend territory as they ran around the top of the mound. And then finally, I mean, there's a couple of other sort of archaeological moments, you know, we're crossing the mound. And then one of the nicest parts is that the edge of that, or the end of that mound, you then kind of, that mound hits the edge of the escarpment, and then the path projects out into the landscape to show you your geography. And I call this a relationship approach because it situates the visitor in an experience of landscape, and it uses the built landscape to set up that experience. I think that's a really beautiful approach. You know, another project that's very famous for this type of approach is this one in Parc en Sanvie by Georges Descamps. And Georges Descamps is one of the great site-specific landscape architects. Now, I won't go into this one in depth, but I will note a little story, which is to say that I drove around the whole of Switzerland to go to this project because it was so famous. And it was the days before, and I had to leave that end of that day. I did a sort of 3-day trip around Switzerland in a car. The end of that day, I had to catch a plane. I had exactly 2 hours to visit the site. It was pre-Google Maps on your phone. So I printed out this packet of instructions sitting on my lap. And at one point it said, go straight ahead. And there was like 4 roads to choose from. I chose the wrong one. And so ultimately I got to this site when I had 10 minutes to visit it before driving 2 hours back to Zurich. And what's interesting is that if we think about the site-specific aspect, it's like about attuning yourself, and it's a bit transcendental, like now I get the site, I'm here, I'm phenomenology, I'm amongst it. But when you're actually, what happens if you go to site and you're in a bad mood? What happens if you had a fight with your loved one and you bring that to site? What if you're depressed? What if you're happy? Every way that we see site is affected by that experience, and my reading of this site was totally affected by the fact I had 10 minutes to see the most site-specific design in the world, you know. So that's I won't go into it, but it's an interesting site. I'll end on this one. This is a great project, and Anton James with James Mather and Delaney are one of my favourite practices. And this project in Sydney Harbour at Cockatoo Island is an extraordinary project. And in a way, what's interesting is that, and the great thing about the Sydney School of Landscape Architects like Aspect, McGregor Coxall, Anton James, Craig Burton, is that they've had this amazing reading of the everyday. So this project, instead of being really highfalutin, and this is the moment for me that I love most, is that that's an existing chair that somebody just used to sit on when they used to probably have their smoke, and they walk outside on this piece of concrete that nobody really cared about. And what Anton did in this design was develop the series of other mechanisms and paths and steps to link the existing everyday moments of the site to then take you through this not so special site, but to in a way introduce you to these kind of domestic relationships on the site. You know, like these sort of moments here, which is, you know, here's a half-made ad hoc group of steps. I think I'll just finish them. You know, it's a lovely strategy. And so with that in mind, just to leave at least a few more minutes for questions, since I know there's a lot of them, I'll hand over to the Prof.
Thank you very much for a wonderful presentation, Dr. Julian. Now we will take the question and answer session. Questions. The first question is by Sumit Vadera. He's an educator and academician. How the changing urban landscape of cities and public spaces post-COVID-19 can be handled pertaining to me, that is human interactive demands.
Oof. Isn't everybody in the entire world thinking about that question right now? You know, I actually think that there's I was writing about this recently, and I think it's too early to tell. And I think that there's a lot to be said for waiting and seeing. The reason I say this is that I don't think we're even slightly out of this situation yet. I think this is the first situation. I think we're in the prelude to other, this is the intro to other potential pandemics. I think we're in the middle of an economic situation, which is going to be quite radical. I think that, I mean, it's hard to understand the whole question, but my response at the moment is that I think that actually private landscape is actually incredibly important. And that's one of the things I've been talking about. I think public landscape is great, but once you put public landscape and social distancing together, and then you put the density of people that somewhere like India has and South Africa has, and some of the really dense places, the landscape that you have, whether it's a pot plant, I mean, in Japan, I saw people have landscapes in cracks in the pavement, very designed landscapes. Those landscapes are actually going to be the landscapes that we live to. And I think that I agree that we have to think about public space, but there's going to be a point at which we need to address this question that in actual fact, separation is going to change the dynamics around public landscapes. And people say it just means those public landscapes are going to be more valuable. Sure, it will, so long as you can get into them. You know, what happens when you divide a landscape by 3 meters? So we get an existing landscape, we divide into a grid of 3 meters, we put one person on every 3 meter grid interval. What does that landscape become? And I think that's a question that we have to go to, but ultimately it may end up that the answer becomes, let's value the domestic landscape more, and let's value the landscapes of families and homes more. And in our density, in our kind of sort of fervour and love of density, particularly in the West now, I think in a way where we're ignoring the fact that the private landscape is a lot of the time where people have been for the last patch. Let's not downplay the role of that landscape.
Thank you. Second question is by Ravindra Deshmukh. He's also an educator and academician. How should design for steep sloping site with road at upper level and the site down below? How to arrest soil erosion on such a site, especially in lower Himalayan region or Sikkim?
Well, you know, I would be asking him that question because, like, you know, that's a professional question where you should have a landscape architect and ask them to solve that question because, you know, we get paid an hourly rate to develop questions like that. But I would say that, you know, I don't know those regions. All I know about the Himalayas is what I read in my mountaineering books. So, you know, I think that that's a highly specific technical question. I think that, you know, my experience has been working with steep sites has been utilising, I've a lot of the time utilised different methods of stabilising paths. In other words, I've actually done projects where I've, for instance, created paths where they have step systems that act like piers to then anchor pathways, walkways between them that act like a retaining wall. I've worked with crib walls, which I don't really like. I've worked with coconut fibre. I've worked with planting. You know, I think that there's so many strategies. That's a hard one. And you know, if you want, tell him if he wants to invite me to the Sikkim Himalaya, I'll come in a second.
Thank you. Next question is by Ayushi Seni, a student. What are the various points for site planning as an architect? I think.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
I did kind of deal with this question a bit at the start. I mean, you know, the way that the variations of this is always from that book Site Planning I talked about. And I think that that tries to have a very material approach to things where it's about taking inventories. Then, you know, you take an inventories of what's on the site, you kind of rank its importance to say what stays and goes, you know, those kind of approaches. But I think what I've been arguing for is to take a more intuitive approach to the site. And so I think that in a way this presentation has probably partly answered that question. And if you want to know about site planning in a kind of classical way, I would say you could read, you know, you could read Lynch and Hack. But I think that once you read it and understand it, I challenge you to reconsider it.
Thank you. Next question is by architect Reshma Sathe, landscape architect. How would the prioritization of physical attributes of site and the culture of locality be established in background studies, especially with respect to large-scale projects?
Now, this is an interesting question because when we get onto large-scale projects and also onto public projects, we're in a situation where we have expectations of defensibility. Now, defensibility has become a major, you know, obviously when we've got public projects, we have an accountability to the people who provide money to be able to ensure that we have a defensible process that is rigorous and stands up to scrutiny. And so I kind of understand the way that question works. And I do think that my answer to that would be that that we design a methodology very carefully, and we make sure that it's actually, we treat the design of methodology as a design act. This is something I have an interesting kind of, an issue with landscape architecture as practice. I'm interested in design. I'm a design studio teacher. I love design, but I'm also very interested in methodology. And these days I'm a bit of a digital guy, and so one of the things I like about, for example, like Grasshopper and Rhino is parametric design. It's not so much parametric, the aesthetics of parametrics, but thinking about parameters and systems. And so I think designing methodology should be treated as a creative act. And in a way, my question, or my urging to the questioner would be to say, how do we, that's a question for you to answer. And the way to answer it is to approach it initially on the basis of what's important to you, and then to begin a process of systematizing how you've made decisions. Because ultimately what happens is that the defensibility, a lot of the time people will defer to systems that have precedent. But behind every system that has a precedent, somebody made an innovation. And so ultimately you have to be able to argue the relevance of your methodology. And so one can still start in an intuitive space and then develop methodologies to demonstrate why. Like if we're affected by something on site, you can dig into that and find the why. So one way of doing it, I think also methodology doesn't have to be linear. Maybe you find those things first that you like, or that moved you, and then just try to dig deeper into why, and then develop a system that is cross-comparable. And I think with that approach, I think you can still work from the kind of ways I'm working and still develop a defensible system.
Next question is from Shikha Jain. She is a professional and practitioner. Can you throw some light on cultural landscape?
Well, I mean, the question to that is there is no landscape that is not a cultural landscape. And I mean, one of the things that really interests me is that particularly in the colonial world, for a long time we were, as a kind of settler colonist, we were treating the indigenous landscape like it was nature. We were treating it as if it didn't have people who were part of it. And then we were treating Western culture as culture. And then obviously that expanded into kind of vernacular studies. I'm not a huge fan of vernacular studies because I think they can lead to mimicry, and I think that can be dangerous. I am a fan of local traditions and building with local traditions. And so the cultural landscape for me is understanding the relationship of what people do and the physical landscape they do it in, and how their human acts shape that landscape. So not the landscape as an artifact or as an aesthetic, or the landscape's like this relationship thing. It's about the body, people doing things. So when we see, for instance, say I'm in the Middle East right now, and say I go to Al Ain, where there's an oasis at Al Ain, and that oasis has a system which is very common in the Arabian Peninsula, where basically date palms are grown on a grid, and beneath the date palms, species grow under, and they're flooded from the aquifer, and then underneath that is another layer of vegetation, and then another layer underneath that. Each one provides shade for the next. Now, those date palms are long gone from being the original date palms, but the practices that made those date palms, that sets those date palms, are still very much alive. And we go back to that question of this famous Japanese idea of the boat, where every piece of the boat has been replaced, but is it the same boat? And so this is where, we know that UNESCO recognises ephemeral practices. So I suppose because I'm interested in gardening, I'm much more interested in the idea that the vernacular and that the cultural landscape is made from the practices. Let's work with those practices and thereby work with that landscape.
Thank you. And the last question we will take because of time.
I thought there were 14. I thought.
Yeah, should we take all? Because.
Well, you were due to finish at what time? In 5 minutes. Let's go to 5 minutes and we'll see how we go.
So we'll take 2 more questions then.
Right.
Okay. This is by Bineet Chajar. He's also a landscape architect. How the entire city is redesigned to save bees in Australia.
Can you To save bees.
To save bees in Australia.
Do you mean bees as in honeybees?
Yeah.
Oh, that is a highly specific question. I think that I'm not, I think, the word an apiarist. So tell him that when they work out the answer, they can tell me.
Okay. We'll move to next question by Niyati Raj, practitioner and professional. Why in real the landscape of the site is processed after architectural building, but building should be planned after the site, in my opinion? I think you have addressed this question through yourself.
I mean, this is the key aspect of landscape, and I mean, as I would always say, to my students, construction is destruction, actually, and so a lot of sites are destroyed in that manner. And I think that obviously we want to cultivate relationships with architects where we develop those things. I've been lucky enough to work with architects who I can have that relationship with. Yeah, otherwise their job is cleaning up afterwards, parsley on the pig, as they say. And so I'm not a fan of that approach, and I completely agree with the questioner. And I think building better relationships with to get in the early design phases, we know that's the answer. Sometimes it's harder to do.
Thank you so much. Now I would like to sum up the session. Summing up is very difficult, but I'll do in brief. As you in the initially you have elaborated on the site planning principles by Kevin Lynch, and then you elaborated on like how observation is a very important tool that for site specificity, and it is about experiencing relationship between characteristics of the place. So observation is very important tool in site specificity. And then for interpretation of site, you gave various examples from the countries like Vietnam, US, and Australia, and about topographical interpretation of a place. Then you elaborated on traces of the site planning, that is how site is a site as an armature, and then how can we think about like underlying geography, then site fragments and things like climate and geology of a site. Then you briefed about two approaches, basically palette and relationship with the site. So palette is basically how can we use site as a material? So how can we take everything from the site and then use on the site? So that is a palette approach. And then you gave examples of Acropolis, Athens, and Prague Castle. Then relationship approach, that is with the site, how to design with the characteristics of the site, that is grounding, finding, and figuring the site. You gave the example of Netherlands, and then through this approach, we can situate the visitor in the experience of landscape. And I think at the end, I can say your presentation was based on like how to design with respect to site, taking into consideration of following aspects of like physiographic aspect, that is natural forms, forces, and processes, that is geology, hydrology, climate, biodiversity, and topography of the region. Then cultural aspects, that is social, political, and economic factors, and even material as a locally available resource. So there are basically two layers, that is primary layer and secondary layer. So primary layers, geological, biological, and cultural, and secondary layers basically experiences and associations. So thank you for such a wonderful presentation, and I hope participants have benefited from the site specificity in landscape architecture. And I would like to thank for accepting our invitation and giving this presentation. I would also like to thank all the participants for being here with us for this seminar. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. See you back soon.
Thank you.
We'll end here. Thank you.